Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kaylee Isaacs. I'm the founder of the Awake Network, and I'm so happy you're joining us for this special live teaching on connecting with purpose and joy in everyday life with one of my very favorite teachers, Thupten Jinpa. As we're all now arriving and settling in, please take a moment to let us know in the chat or comments wherever you're tuning in who you are and where you're tuning in from. It's always nice to get a sense of who's joining together for these. And we'll be turning off the chat during Jinpa's presentation and guided practice so we can settle in a bit together before turning it back on during the Q&A section, which will be coming at the end of the call. So I feel so lucky to have Thupten Jinpa sharing with us today. He doesn't really need much of an introduction, but I can't help but highlight a few of his many accomplishments. Jinpa has a special ability to bridge both Eastern and Western, ancient and modern approaches to cultivating compassion, and has a unique background serving as the principal English translator to His Holiness the Dalai Lama since 1985. He was trained as a monk at Sartse College of Ganden Monastic University and also holds a BA in philosophy and a PhD in religious studies from Cambridge University. He's also the principal creator of the Compassion Cultivation Training, CCT, which he developed while at Stanford University in 2009, and which is now offered through the Compassion Institute, which he co-founded in 2017. In addition to the Institute's traditional 8-week training, Jinpa has also created a shorter 2-week online class called Building Compassion from the Inside Out to support people in all walks of life in discovering more meaning, purpose, and joy in their lives through this compassion training. So thank you so much, Jinpa, for being with us today.
Thank you. First of all, good evening and good afternoon to all of you. Maybe for some of you, it might be a good night. So let me first of all thank the Awake Network for inviting me back and giving me the opportunity to meet with your community. I really see the Awake Network as an important community of like-minded individuals coming together who share certain aspirations for the world and also values that are underpinned by that aspiration. So thank you, Kaylee and Megan and everyone at the Awake Network for thinking of me and bringing me back once in a while to meet with your community members. As you suggested, that we agreed that for this particular community gathering, we could focus more on purpose and joy in everyday life. And I think this is really important. I remember when talking about purpose, when I was very young, when I first began to actually consciously take seriously my own monastic training, there's a genre of instructional text in Tibetan tradition, which are meant to be practical instructions on cultivating your own spiritual path. I remember quite often these texts open with a statement that as human beings, we should consciously live our life with purpose. And sometimes some of these authors would say that just living is something that all creatures do. What should distinguish us human beings is to live that life consciously, and by consciously with a sense of purpose. So in growing up as a monk, this idea of living a life consciously with a sense of purpose is really drilled into my brain, as it were. And interestingly, in the Tibetan tradition, of course, which is heavily influenced by the Buddhist religious kind of perspective, a purpose is very tied to kind of an altruistic orientation of living your life, not for yourself, but for others. So this is the Bodhisattva ideal. And in fact, in the Tibetan language itself, the word for purpose and word for benefit, bringing benefit, making a difference, is closely tied. So now we know, for example, the beautiful thing about something like Buddhism and modern science and contemporary thoughts coming together is that certain ideas in traditional teachings can be distilled and now introduced with a new light. So, for example, this emphasis on the sense of purpose, we now know from research after research on well-being and happiness that one of the most important elements towards happy life is a sense of purpose. In fact, the sense of purpose is a predictor for longevity and healthy life as well. And at the heart of this sense of purpose, as Buddhism proposes, is really this altruistic orientation towards others, that you live your life not just for yourself, you live your life with a kind of a focus on other person. And so this service orientation and altruistic orientation and the connection of that with a sense of purpose and purposeful life is really now increasingly we are beginning to appreciate it. For example, in research, one of the key findings in research on happiness is, in addition to purpose, is the sense of connection with other people in your life. And this connection with other people in your life, a genuine connection, really presupposes a kind of a gesture on your part of opening. If you are completely closed, you don't create any space for others to be in your life. Then a sense of connection requires two things connecting or two beings connecting. So openness on your part becomes an important element for that sense of connection. So these two elements, sense of purpose and social connectedness, are turning out to be the key predictors for a happy life and joyful life. Now, when we talk about happiness and joy, it's important, many of you might have participated in the Joy Summit, which was triggered by this very successful and important film, the Mission Joy, with Archbishop Desmond Tutu and His Holiness, entering into a 5-day conversation, which I had the privilege to be, at. When we talk about joy, as these two great teachers remind us, we shouldn't be fixated on joy in the sense of a pleasurable sensation. Of course, pleasurable sensation is important, but a deeper joy or happiness really is at the mental level. It takes the form of a sense of satisfaction, a sense of fulfillment. Now, sense of fulfillment can only arise when we have a purpose. And when that purpose is fulfilled, then you feel a sense of fulfillment, sense of, satisfaction. And that really is the joy. And this kind of joy is, in fact, very important. And in one of the very important insights in Buddhist psychology is the role joy plays in sustaining our motivation. Now, this is an important point because quite often, like in the West, it's a part of the cultural tradition to, on the first day of the new year, you make a resolution. I'm going to go to gym every week kind of thing, But then initially you go, but then the will at some point loses its steam. Now, the question is, why is it that you are motivated, you want to do it, but somehow you can't seem to be able to sustain it? And this is where the insight of Buddhist psychology is important, because Buddhist psychology tells us that initially you might exert your will to get you do something. So it's the initial push may come from the will. But for that movement to sustain, you need to find a way to get joy. So once you are able to get joy, for example, like if exercising is your commitment, somehow you have to find a way to do it in a way that you enjoy it. Okay. And then you also begin to see the results of that exercise. And then when you see the results, then you get more motivated because you see a purpose for that commitment that you have made. So this joy, in this deeper sense of satisfaction and fulfillment is really what can keep us going. Now, many of us who are gathered here, one thing that brings us together is our passion to see a better world. And if possible, to play an active role in making that possible. So many of us gathered here share the value that we want to do something to make our world a better place, at least make a difference in someone's life. So in other words, all of us gathered here are really deeply inspired by the ideal of compassion, kindness, making a difference in someone's life. So now, compassionate action and being there for others on a sustained basis, you need to find a joy in there. Not necessarily I'm saying that you should actually enjoy doing what you're doing, but you need to find a way to get a sense of fulfillment. And this sense of fulfillment will only arise if you take seriously this ideal of making a difference in someone's life. Being compassionate, being kind, being there for others, helping others. So here, what we see is a kind of an intimate connection between purpose, joy, sense of satisfaction, and motivation. Now, what connects all of this is really compassion. And this is one of the reasons why someone like His Holiness has dedicated his life in promoting the value of compassion, and reminding each one of us this is a power that is inherent within us, that each one of us can tap into to really kind of make a difference, not only in our own life, but in the lives of others as well. So this, and the beautiful thing about compassion is that it is a natural quality that we all have. Maybe we don't pay attention to it. Maybe we're not fully aware of it. Maybe we don't have the language to talk about it. But compassion as a felt human quality is universal. And all of us will recognize that in moments in our life, we've experienced that powerfully. For example, if you come across someone who's really suffering and crying, if you let your natural human response to come out, it's going to be a compassionate response. That's who we are. We are empathic social creatures. We can choose to suppress that expression of who we are as a human being. We can bring other considerations like, oh, he's a stranger, I don't know him, maybe he doesn't speak my language. All of these considerations we can bring in as a kind of a hindrance to block our natural human response. But if we allow our natural human response, we all have the capacity to feel what the other person is feeling and connect. So that's who we are. So this compassion as a quality, as an impulse, is not something that we have to learn. It's a given. It's something that we have learned from, His Holiness often says that the first teacher of compassion is your mother. He himself says that, he doesn't consider his Buddhist teachers to be the first teachers on compassion. He considers his mother to be the first teacher of compassion. So because in that bond between the mother-child relationship, there is this total unconditionality on the part of both sides. There is a deep connection. That is the heart of compassion. When a genuine compassion arises for someone, there is no room for judgment. There is no hesitation. There is a total acceptance. So, and we have that capacity. So what Buddhist teachings emphasize is to really shine a spotlight on that. There is a beautiful saying attributed to the Buddha in one of the Mahayana scriptures where Buddha says that what is that one virtue? When you have it, all other virtues come into your hand. It is compassion. So the idea here is that if you need to choose one thing, one virtue to cultivate, then it should be compassion, because all other virtues come as a byproduct, whether it's the ability to forgive someone, whether it's ability to let go of resentment, whether it is ability to see the other person's perspective, whether it is ability to be more resilient in the face of suffering. All of these really arise as a byproduct of cultivating our natural compassion. So I think this, those of us who, see ourselves as embracing compassion as our explicit personal value and want to see more of this in the world, I think in relation to purpose and joy, it's more smart. It will be smarter to focus on compassion so that purpose and joy comes as a byproduct. In fact, the joy is one of those funny things that you cannot will it. You cannot consciously find joy. Joy always comes as a byproduct. It's like falling in love. You cannot just will yourself to fall in love. The conditions have to be there so that it naturally arises. Same thing goes for joy. And similarly, purpose is something that will motivate you, but purpose is tied to your own value as well. So again, you cannot seek purpose consciously. Somehow, it's only through cultivating virtues like compassion that a genuine sense of purpose and joy connected with that can arise. And when we are able to do this, then the life becomes quite beautiful. In fact, when you consciously embrace compassion as your organizing principle of your life, as the foundation, you then make compassion as the default position from which you relate to everything that happens in your life, including adversities and difficult situations and difficult relationships. When that happens, actually a courage kicks in because, first of all, you don't have a self-interest or selfish agenda in that interaction. So when you don't have a selfish agenda in an interaction, you are braver because what you see is what you get. There's a transparency. When there is a transparency, there's a moral clarity in that situation. When there's a moral clarity, many of the problems that you normally come with, the guilt and regret and all of these go away. So compassion has this ability to really bring moral clarity into a situation. So there's a kind of a transparency, and that creates a much more courageous, mind frame. There's a sense of ease that comes from this, because in the end, many of the problems that we face in our life, beyond the immediate struggles for livelihood, shelter, and clothing, has to do with our interaction with others. And in that interaction, if you can, as your default position, interact first from the place of recognizing shared humanity, things will be very, very different. Of course, that does not mean that you have to give in every time. You have to sort of let people take advantage of you. None of them. And even taking compassion as an active stand, as your first default response, can then bring out the clarity of a situation where you then need to take a firmer stand and respond in a stronger way. You can do it. Compassion does not entail, compassionate response doesn't entail giving in, letting people do what they want, taking advantage of you. But what it does mean is never to forget the humanity of the other person. Always relate to the other person as a default first response from a place of recognition of shared humanity. When one is capable of doing that, then even dealing with difficult people in our life, there will be a kind of a sense of ease, because, like I often tell my Buddhist, fellow Tibetan Buddhist audience that let's remember that even the Buddha was not able to convert all the Indians of his time into Buddhism, and he was a truly enlightened being. So, and there were people who were criticizing the Buddha during his time. So in our life, for whatever reason, karmic, we're always going to have people who are not going to like us. That's a fact. We can't make everybody love us. So given this, it is in our own self-interest to be able to have a skillful way of handling difficult relationships and difficult interactions. And again, there, passion can bring that confidence. So by focusing on compassion, this is one of the reasons why, if you look at the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the resources on compassion meditation is extensive. We have the four immeasurables: immeasurable joy, immeasurable compassion, loving kindness, and equanimity. So we do this in the form of a prayer, may all beings be, happy, and so on. But the actual focus when it comes to meditative cultivation is concerned, the focus is on really compassion. And the idea here is that if you focus your attention on cultivation of compassion, exercising that muscle, then many of the virtues will fall into place. And I think there is some powerful insight in this. And then, of course, Tibetan tradition is deeply inspired by the Indian Buddhist tradition. And among the Indian Buddhist authors, one of the most influential one is the 8th century ethical teacher, Shantideva. Some of you may be familiar. Shantideva wrote this book entirely in verse called Guide to the Bodhisattva Way. And the first chapter of that is a eulogy to the altruistic intention, referred to as the bodhicitta, the awakening mind. And I remember when I was a kid, I memorized this entire text. And at that time, I was in South India. My monastery was part of the Tibetan resettlement project. We were clearing the forest in a developing agricultural land. So we had to work in the fields. And I memorized that text during the breaks while working in the fields. I was about 14 years old. And I remember in the one particular verse in the opening chapter where Shantideva says that the Buddhas have contemplated for eons, have come to recognize the most important thing is the cultivation of your altruistic intention. That's a powerful statement. And I remember really being struck by this. And then Shantideva goes on to say, therefore, those who wish to alleviate sufferings of sentient beings should focus on this. Those who wish to bring the 100-fold joys to other beings should focus on this. And he goes on to say, that one should never let go of that altruistic orientation of the mind. So this, today, we are really fortunate to be able to have a situation where many of these practices and techniques and tools that are traditionally embedded in religious framework, such as in Buddhist practice, are now extracted and made available for everyday person, regardless of what our background is, religious or not religious. And this is one area where the science and the clinical applications of science have really played an important role. And in this day and age, when the world is becoming more complicated, our life is simple living in a day-to-day is now becoming quite complicated because, the fact that you have to master smart technologies, I feel so sorry for the elderly who are in their late 80s who can't see well, and then everything is now pressing on a screen which has no response, where the old-fashioned screens, the buttons, where remote controls, when you press, you feel there's a tactile sensation. The modern ones are all screens. But we are now living in a world where everything is quite complicated and complex. And, and so many distractions call our attention left and right. So in this day and age, I think as individuals, and this is one area where I feel education is one area where as a society, we could be more conscious and smarter to really teach and learn skills, mental skills, to be able to live our life consciously, so that we are not living our life just being swept away by, the outside forces. And if we are not able to do this, it is pretty depressing, because the attention is a finite resource, okay? But shiny things, shiny objects always attract us. So if we are not able to exercise some kind of value and conscious will to be able to regulate our attention, we get completely distracted. And when we are completely distracted and when we are living a life of reactivity, reaction, then we don't really have a chance to live a truly conscious, purposeful life. So I think in this situation, paying attention to resources that are coming from these secularized contemplative practices, such as mindfulness, loving kindness, compassion, conscious living, paying attention to these, adopting some of these techniques that are there, all of these are really in our own personal benefit, because that way, then we can live our life consciously. And when we are able to live our life consciously, then we can live our life with a purpose. Because otherwise, we may have the best intention, we may have the highest value, but if we are not able to live consciously, then we are not going to be able to direct our life's energy and focus to that, what we want to see in the world. So I think here, tapping into the Buddhist resources. I mean, this is one of the reasons why His Holiness has spent so much time sitting down with scientists, clinical researchers, and he has actually made it explicit, said, look, you can look at the Buddhist meditation practice resources and dig into them, study them, test them, evaluate them, and then develop universal applications of them. And as a result, we now see a lot of them in the mindfulness domain, in the loving kindness practice, emotion regulation, now increasingly compassion as well. So I think, for all of us who truly want to live a conscious life with a sense of purpose, I think our aspiration alone is not adequate. I think we need to learn some of these mental skills, how to consciously pay attention, how to calm our mind, how to apply with a focus, and how to exercise our compassionate muscle so that we can expand our empathic scope. All of these are mental techniques which are now available. So I urge all of you to pay attention to these so that we can learn the actual tools which will then enable us to live a life with a sense of purpose, consciously, in our own terms, so that we are not living our life in a reactive way all the time. So, and especially those who are parents, I think it would be really helpful to, draw attention to some of these mental skills to your children so that they learn these skills like conscious paying attention, learning to focus, regulating your attention, and sometimes restraining from being swept away by impulses. These are important skills that can really help all of us, and especially children. So this is what I wanted to share with you. And, I have been fortunate to be able to have brought up in my own Tibetan Buddhist culture where compassion is everywhere, very explicit. And I've also had the privilege to be at this crossroad of contemporary, world and my traditional Buddhist background. And as much as I can, I try to, be conscious of that position I have so that I can be a medium through which I can share some of the treasures from my own tradition in a more secular, universal way to as many people as possible. And this is one of the reasons why I developed that CCT at Stanford and now being disseminated through Compassion Institute. And so many of you who are here are probably meditation teachers, and in important positions, having access to a lot of other people. I think being able to share some of these techniques of the mind, which allow individuals, in some sense, they empower individuals who can then live their life consciously with a compassionate kind of heart, and with also a degree of wisdom, because we need some wisdom to be able to see, what is right and what is wrong. So in this way, I think there's a real chance that we can live a life with a purpose and joy. And the foundation of that is really compassion. So I wanted to emphasize that point. So we will stop here, and maybe we can participate, come together in a very brief reflective practice before we do the question and answer. Thank you. So for the practice, I'll invite all of you to just reposture, position yourself to find a more comfortable, relaxed posture. And if you're sitting on a chair, keep your feet flat on the ground. And as much as possible, keep your spine straight. The key to the physical posture is relaxed, which facilitates alertness. So no slouching. Now with this posture, let's just slow down our mind and body by resting our attention on our breath, as if noticing for the first time that you are breathing. The air coming in and going out. And as you breathe in this way, notice also the energy of your body and mind slowing down. As if you could literally feel that silence that dawns upon you. Now let's all connect with that spark in all of us, the aspiration and the wish to see a more compassionate world, a kinder, a safer world for all. That wish, let's connect with that. So while conscious of that wish to see a better world, a more compassionate world, let's be brave and bring to mind the image of suffering. Some of you may have people in your life who are going through a tough time. Or bring to mind image from a suffering from anywhere in the world that we see on our television. The war in Europe, in Sudan, the challenges in Afghanistan. Just bring to mind an image of suffering and let your heart be open to it. Imagine what it must be like to be in such a situation. The feeling of anxiety, fear, uncertainty. now offer the following phrases. May you be free from suffering. May you find hope. May you find courage. May you be safe. And if you can even imagine light rays going out from your heart, these places of suffering, bringing courage, hope. Let's now expand our scope and include the entire world, our troubled world, which is increasingly becoming more troubled right now. And including ourselves with all others, let's silently say the following phrases. May we all find peace. May we all be free from suffering. May we all find happiness. And may we all be kind to each other. Let's stay for a while with that energy of these thoughts. Let's bring our attention back on our breathing, noticing the air coming in and going out. Then bring your awareness back into your body, noticing the points where we feel contact. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes now. Thank you. So we could have, we have about 20 minutes, more than 20 minutes, yeah, for question and answers. So Haley, you're going to guide us through this?
Yes, thank you so much, Jinpa, for that beautiful practice. We'll be beginning with the Q&As. So if you have any questions for Jinpa, go ahead and ask them in the Q&A section at the bottom of Zoom if you're watching in Zoom, or in the chat if you're on YouTube. We've had a bunch of good questions come in already. And so to start us off, we've had a couple questions come in about self-compassion. So to sort of combine questions, can you speak to how self-compassion works in the equation of compassion, joy, and fulfillment? And if there's instances when compassion for the other might be in conflict with compassion for oneself.
That's a really, really good question. I mean, increasingly, research is pointing out that the capacity for a healthy self-compassion is very, very important, especially for having more resilient mind. So it's crucially important. But I personally prefer not to dichotomize self versus compassion for others. I prefer to see the two of them as belonging to a broader rubric, which is compassion. And when compassion is natural in its natural state, compassion is focused on others. It's a relational human response and a quality that comes from this. And biologically, evolutionarily speaking, one could argue that human capacity for compassion and empathy, which is the basis, has to do with the importance of making social connection, especially for the child to be able to bond with a caregiver. And the relationship with that is crucial for the survival. So compassion in its natural kind of state or basic state is really other oriented. But compassion for others, compassion for self, is that same compassion where now we are directing it at ourselves. So that's it's not an either or situation or two different streams of experience. Yes, sometimes there will be situations where you need to take a step back, where you need to rejuvenate yourself, sort of renew yourselves, in which case it's not so much a conflict of compassion for others versus compassion for yourself. It's really, sort of expressing your compassion with greater self-awareness. So I think the capacity, a healthy way of being self-compassionate depends upon your own level of self-awareness, because individuals vary on, some people have the tremendous capacity to be available for others without getting burned out easily. Some people get emotionally exhausted more easily. So you have to find what that level is for you, and you need to recognize it. So the greater self-awareness you have, the more you will be able to detect the early signs of getting there, in which case then you are able to take them, even with the important people in your life whose depends upon your caregiving, you can be conscious and explicit and say, look, I need to rest. I need to renew myself, because it's in the interest of that other person for you to be available in a more sustained basis. So I think self-compassion is crucial. But self-compassion, I think the healthy self-compassion is best practiced with a degree of self-awareness. So, and also, as much as possible, if you can frame the issue of self-compassion and its importance from a more altruistic orientation, not from a self-referential perspective, but from the perspective of you being more available for people in your life. So we can reframe the question of self-compassion from an overall altruistic orientation, within which sometimes self-awareness dictates that you need to step back and renew yourself to create, the boundary is probably not the right word, but you recognize that boundary. So that's at least how I approach the question of self-compassion.
Thank you, Jinpa. Our second question is from an anonymous attendee asking, how can we practice compassion towards individuals who have acted unethically by pretending that their actions were in our best interest, even though they have caused us harm?
That's a really good question. And it's an important challenge that you have to recognize, because the last thing you want is compassion in the form of a wishy-washy, just let everything, other people do whatever they want. And that is, in fact, sometimes in situations where a genuine compassionate response would require you telling off the other person, you calling spade a spade, taking a firm stand, because even from the point of view of this other person, if that person gets negatively habituated to that line of abusive behavior, that person is going to have a difficult relationship throughout that person's life. So you can, even from a compassionate, altruistic perspective, sometimes in those kind of situations, you have to tell that person off and tell that what they did was wrong. But when you do that, don't do it as much as possible. Avoid it from the perspective of a self-referential argument. As much as possible, do it from taking into account the interest and well-being of the other person as well. And sometimes, it may be necessary for you to sort of avoid that situation or interaction, because if the interaction leads only to a negative reaction and response, then for a while, it's probably better to avoid. So this is one area where a successful practice of compassion requires the application of wisdom. And this is why in Buddhist tradition, compassion and wisdom are seen as the two sides of the same story, two wings of the bird. So, that will balance each other. So I think a degree of insight and understanding and wisdom could really help.
Thank you, Jinpa. Our next question is from Carrie, asking, what is a best practice for finding joy when experiencing deep suffering?
I think when you are experiencing deep suffering, through mindfulness practice, if you can learn the skill to be with suffering without denying it, without pushing it away, without resisting and fighting it, that's a tough one. That's the first step, so that you pay attention, you bring awareness of the situation, but with almost like a kind of a lightness of a touch. So what is happening is that you're observing your own experience of suffering without being sucked into it. Because that large part of the added dimension of suffering really comes from our mentalization, our mental response to this. Okay? So pain, like physical illness and difficulties, these are natural events. But how we respond to these natural events, add another layer of suffering. So there, I think initially, being able to learn some skills to simply observe and be aware and not rush in, not suppress, not resist. And this is a skill that modern mindfulness, is very good at. It's the application of meta-awareness, just being, bringing an awareness at the meta level, observing it in almost like a kind of a detached observer. That I think is a really good one. And once you are able to do that, then your tendency to negatively judge or blame yourself and guilt and all of these will be prevented. And then one compassionate response is also to remember others who might be in a similar situation. That I think is an important part of that more compassionate response, because you are relating to suffering as a human experience, shared universally by many others. And that way, the loneliness will be no longer there, because often when we're going through a very difficult time, what makes the experience of suffering so acutely unbearable is the feeling of being alone. So when you are able to sort of recognize others are also experiencing a similar kind of situation, that you recognize yourself in relation to others, that will also bring a kinder, gentler response to the suffering. So those are different ways in which you can really look at the suffering, and any experience, even a negative one, really, there's always, if you look at it from a different angle, there will be an opportunity that you can see from that adverse situation. So I think these are ways in which one can respond to the situation.
Thank you, Jinpa. We have so many good questions coming in. So I have one here from Banu, I think is in relationship to the connection between joy and sadness. So Banu asks, wouldn't compassion for every being make us sad for all the beings that are suffering? How will we be able to cultivate joy while being compassionate towards old age, death, and physical ailments?
That's a really good question. I think sadness, of course, nobody wants to be sad, but I think sadness is also a very important human emotion. And the ability to feel sad is what makes us empathetic towards others. So I think this ability, the sadness, but one of the important things is that when we open our heart, when we think about may all beings be free from suffering, um, rationally speaking, you're right, because there's never going to be an end to suffering. So we are sort of building up ourselves to a total disaster and failure and disappointment. But one of the important things that we have to learn from practice of compassion is also a degree of humility. Because yes, we aspire all sufferings to be eliminated, but we also recognize that there are going to be sufferings. So, there are going to be suffering. So recognition of the reality of suffering is important. And when we wish all beings to be free from suffering, what we are doing is we're actually honoring all sentient beings' wish to be free from suffering. So I think this is, this humility, recognizing that not all sufferings could be removed, is an important one. And the joy will really come from you being able to make a difference by helping someone. By, when you make compassion as your key value in life, yes, you're going to be moved by suffering. Yes, there will be an element of distress and sadness that comes with it when you think about the suffering. But that distress, that sadness is going to motivate you, because that sadness is the expression of your empathy. And when empathy expresses in the form of a compassion, which is where the action dimension comes in, because sadness alone is at the level of emotion, it's empathy. But in order for empathy to be regulated, healthy way, we need to give an outlet to do something. And there compassion comes in. So compassion brings the action dimension, and you feel more empowered. So when you feel sadness, you have to not push it away, you have to acknowledge it, and then use that feeling of being moved by someone's suffering to be able to do something, or at least try to do something, be there. So that's, and the joy is not so much a pleasure, but it's from a sense of fulfillment, of making a difference.
Thank you, Jinpa. So we have time for maybe one more question. I wanted to leave just a few minutes at the end. I let people know in an email that we sent out that we'd also have a moment to hear more about your 2-week course, Compassion from the Inside Out. And so I think this might be our last question from Sandy. What are some ways to generate more compassion for yourself and others daily?
I think being able to remind ourselves to bring kindness to every situation, that I think is a simple exercise. When, for example, you're being a little harsh to yourself, just remind yourself kindness. So, in the Tibetan tradition, we use mantra a lot. Om Mani Padme Hum is the mantra that Tibetans chant on a regular basis. So maybe you can turn kindness into a kind of a mantra, like be kind, and just have a card, put it in the visible places where you're going to likely to see, or carry with you. So in relation to both yourself and others, as much as if you remember bringing kindness, that I think is an important step. So now the bringing kindness presupposes that you are being able to bring some awareness. So that's why I think paying attention to how you naturally respond or habitually respond to situation, paying attention, bringing more awareness is also an important part of that. Because sometimes, when we may want to bring kindness, but we react because we fail to bring awareness into the situation. So, you should combine learning to pay more attention to the way in which you normally tend to react to the situation, so that you can catch yourself, and then remembering to bring kindness. So awareness and kindness are the two first steps. And when you turn that into habit, then at some point it will become easier.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for all of your wonderful questions. I wish we had another hour or two to be able to go through all of them. And it's just inspiring to feel so many of us coming together as this global group with such beautiful intentions. And I know that myself and many others find your teachings, Jinpa, so clear and generous. And
I wouldn't call them teachings, but anyway, if you want to call it that way.
And so before we close, we know that you have a 2-week online class, Building Compassion from the Inside Out, that's coming up with another cohort starting in just about a week. And so I think for those of us who are interested in going deeper and continuing to practice in this way and building our compassion muscle, as you said earlier in the call, it would be wonderful to hear a little bit more about that opportunity and just to hear a little bit more about what we might expect from the course.
Well, the course is actually a 6-part, divided into 12 weeks. So one lesson for every 2 weeks, kind of, and the cohort-based system approach. And the idea here is to really, the content of the course is really a distillation of what I see as the beautiful insights coming out of this coming together of Buddhist practice and psychological insights with contemporary research in science and clinical applications. And so the aim of this course is to provide quite a comprehensive but very accessible experiential approach to understanding the psychology of compassion. Because sometimes we tend to have a very naive, simplistic attitude towards compassion. Oh yeah, that's the thing, it's the kindness thing. But compassion is deeper than that. And because compassion is such a fundamental quality of who we are as human beings, tapping into its power really will make a huge difference in the quality of our life. And I think, I argue in this presentation that up until recently, contemporary science has failed to appreciate the place of compassion in human nature. So, and because of this, the contemporary society and contemporary knowledge systems never have explored the benefits of cultivating compassion, which the Buddhist tradition has done. So this 6-part course is a really way to flesh out in some detailed way, what compassion looks like, what are the resistances that we bring, how does compassion show up, and what exactly do we mean by this, and then also, how to exercise that muscle through training. And finally, how to make compassion a proactive stance so that we can live our life on a daily basis by making compassion conscious as a active principle in our everyday lives. So that's the kind of the content of the course. And the structure is designed in such a way that there is a kind of because compassion is, I always say, the most important aspect of compassion is the relationality. So the cohort approach is an important one where there is a peer-to-peer sharing and learning, which reaffirms universality of the experiences of compassion. So that's the approach. And, I would like to request all of you to take interest in this. And this will also offer a vehicle to deepen your own exploration into your natural compassion.
Thank you, Jinpa. I'm so glad that you created this course and we're able to share it with everyone today, because I think it's a great way for people to get involved, and it's so accessible with the 2-week structure, and also how it's been structured with the sliding scale model so that it's really accessible in that way as well. And also that it includes another live Q&A session with you, which I think is really enjoyable. And so the new cohort will be starting May 8th, and we'll be chatting a link right now in the Zoom chat that I would recommend clicking on, because when we close the call in just a minute, that will go away. So that should be showing up in the chat and then also on YouTube. And after this call ends, we'll be sharing the recording. So if you want to watch again or share with any friends or family, you'll be able to see a recording of this on the same page where you accessed it in about 10 minutes. And we'll make sure to put a button or a link right under the video so you can easily get that as well. And so that should be available in the chat. And let me just see if there's any more details that were helpful to cover for the call. I think those are the main details. It'll be starting in a week, so it's good timing. And we're right on time, right at the hour. When does that happen? So thank you so much to everyone for being here, for your openness and questions and practicing together and exploring how we can bring more joy, purpose, and compassion into our lives. And of course, thank you, Jinpa, so much for sharing your big heart and wisdom with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for being part of this community gathering, and thank you, Kaylee and Megan, for giving me this opportunity. It's a real joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jinpa. And so we'll close in just a moment. Again, the link should be chatted there. I just want to give people another minute just to click so that they don't lose it, because it won't be up for another few minutes after this call ends. But thank you, Jinpa, and thank you, everyone else. I hope to see you all and be together again soon.